The Warmth That Stays. Chapter 1. The Bolt. The lighthouse road northeast of town was open, but nobody used it in February unless they had to. Nora had to. Cole had called her at 7 in the morning, while she was still in her coat by the door with her coffee going cold. Site documentation, he said. County forensic liaison was already on his way up from Rockland. She was to meet him at the cottage, assist with photography and the written record, and stay out of his way. She drove the blacktop with the heater running hard and the harbor visible through the pines on her left, half frozen at the pilings, the water beyond it the color of old pewter. No other cars on the road. The February light was already up, but it did nothing for warmth, flat and pale and directionless, the kind of light that illuminated without contributing. She had grown up with Maine winters, and she still had not made her peace with February specifically. January was honest about what it was. March carried the suggestion of an ending. February was neither. It simply continued, grinding and gray, as though it had forgotten there was supposed to be something on the other side of it. She thought about Conrad Ashford while she drove. She had seen him twice in the past year, once at the harbor master's office, arguing about a mooring permit, with the particular intensity of a man who had decided the principle mattered more than the outcome. Once at the gas station on Route 1, filling a dark green Land Rover with the careful deliberateness of someone who did everything carefully and deliberately. He had not acknowledged her either time. She was not sure he had seen her. He was the kind of man who moved through a town like Harrow Cove without quite inhabiting it, present, visible, and fundamentally apart. Now he was in a chair, in a locked room, at the top of a lighthouse cottage, and the county forensic liaison was driving up from Rockland to tell everyone it was probably his heart. The Cape Heron Lighthouse stood at the end of a gravel spur off the main road, decommissioned and dark. The lighthousing sealed with painted steel. The cottage at its base was stone, 2 stories, expanded over the years into something larger than its origins suggested. Nora parked behind the county forensic van and sat for a moment looking at the building. The stone was dark with coastal moisture, the mortar lines sharp and deep in the flat February light. A building that had been built to last, and had lasted, and was now the kind of place that accumulated history the way stone accumulates cold, slowly, completely, without any intention of giving it back. The county forensic liaison was a man named Hecht, mid-50s, with the efficient manner of someone who had processed too many scenes to find any of them surprising. He acknowledged Nora with a nod and handed her a clipboard. "Patrol officer," he said. "Yes?" Cole said documentation support. "That's right." He nodded again and turned back to his kit. He had already photographed the exterior. The cottage door was open, held with a rubber wedge. Nora followed him inside. The staircase was narrow and steep, the stone walls carrying the cold the way stone does, holding it past the point where the air itself had warmed. She ran her hand along the wall as she climbed, not for balance, but from habit, the texture of old mortar, the slight irregularity of hand-cut stone, the material record of someone's labor 100 years ago. The study door at the top of the stairs was open, now Hecht's doing, she assumed, though she did not ask how. The room stopped her for a moment. 3 walls of glass facing the Atlantic, floor to ceiling. The winter sea filling the room from every angle, flat and dark and immense, stretching to a horizon that was barely distinguishable from the sky above it. 1 wall of bookshelves, the shelves interrupted by a stone hearth. It was the kind of room that announced its owner's priorities without apology. Conrad Ashford had wanted to watch the ocean from a warm room with his books around him and his bourbon in hand, and he had arranged his life accordingly. And there was something almost admirable in the clarity of that, even now. Conrad himself sat in the leather armchair to the right of the hearth, with his hands in his lap and a glass of bourbon on the side table that had not been touched. He looked diminished in the chair, which surprised her. In both her encounters with him, he had seemed large, self-contained, a man who occupied space with intention. Here he was simply old and still, the winter light coming through 3 walls of glass and finding nothing to illuminate. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Accidental," Hecht said, without looking up from his forms. "Cardiac event, probably. Medical examiner will confirm." Nora said nothing. She uncapped her pen and began on the clipboard. She worked her way around the room in a slow, clockwise circuit, photographing and logging. 3 window panels, latched from the inside. The brass bolt on the study door, thrown from the inside. The bourbon glass. The cold hearth. She moved carefully, the way she had been trained to move in a scene, touching nothing she did not need to touch, letting the room speak in its own order rather than the order she expected. She stopped at the firebox. The spark arrestor on the grate was new, clean steel, no discoloration from heat, the mounting screws without rust. The stone hearth around it was old, the mortar between the stones worn smooth. The lintel above blackened from decades of fires. The floor of the firebox itself darkened with the accumulated residue of 100 winters' worth of burning. The arrestor was inconsistent with everything around it. Not wrong exactly, just new in a way that old things notice. She thought about the fires Conrad would have lit in this hearth every evening. Agnes would later tell her, reliable as a clock, a man alone in a room with 3 walls of winter sea, making a small contained warmth for himself, doing it the same way every night because the sameness was part of the point. She photographed the arrestor, logged it, filed it away without yet knowing where it belonged. Hecht glanced over. Anything? New arrestor on an old hearth. Nora said, "Probably nothing." "Probably," he agreed, and went back to his forms. She finished the circuit and stood at the north-facing window panel, looking at the latch. She pressed it with 2 fingers. It moved, a slight, almost imperceptible play in the lever when she pressed it sideways. The other 2 latches were stiff and tight. This one was not. She pressed it again, feeling the tolerance in the mechanism, the small looseness that years of coastal wind had worked into the metal. She did not say anything to Hecht about the latch. Outside, through the glass, the Atlantic was flat and colorless under the February sky, the horizon barely distinguishable from the water. The ice on the exterior of the glass caught the pale light and held it. On the inside of the north panel, the frost in the lower latch housing was denser than on the other 2 windows, extending slightly further up the frame. The pattern different in a way she could not yet name, the way a word sometimes sits at the edge of memory without arriving. She photographed it anyway. By 9:30. Hecht had what he needed. He pulled off his gloves and told Nora the county lab would have preliminary results within 48 hours. He expected cardiac. He said it with the confidence of a man who had been right enough times to stop questioning himself. Nora thanked him and wrote his name and departure time in her log, and watched him carry his kit back down the narrow staircase. She stood alone in the study for a moment after he left. The room was very quiet. The winter sea filled the glass on 3 sides, vast and indifferent, doing what the sea did in February, simply continuing, gray and cold and absolute, without any interest in the particular dramas of the shore. Conrad's bourbon sat untouched on the side table. His hands were still in his lap. The cold hearth held its cold ash. She thought about a man who lit a fire in the same place every night and sat in the same chair and poured himself the same drink and watched the same sea. The comfort of repetition. The way a ritual, repeated long enough, stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the shape of a life. She thought about what it would take to use that shape against someone. She kept her pen and went downstairs. She stopped at Ed's on the way to the station, because it was on the way, and because she had not eaten, and because some questions arranged themselves better in a warm kitchen than in a cold car. She had learned this about herself over the past year, that thinking happened differently when her hands were wrapped around something warm, when there was another person in the room, even if neither of them was speaking, when the small, ordinary sounds of a house going about its business were present around the edges of the silence. Ed was at the stove when she came in through the side door, salt cod hash in the pan, bread on the board. Biscuit lifted his head from the base of the oven door, decided she was not interesting enough to justify moving, and put it back down. "Cole's scene," Ed said, without turning around. "Documentation support," Nora said. She hung her coat on the hook and sat at the table. "Hecht thinks cardiac. What do you think?" She set the clipboard on the table. She looked at it for a moment, the logged photographs, the latch notation, the entry about the spark arrestor written in her own careful hand. "I think a man with floor-to-ceiling glass and a harbor view replaces his spark arrestor for a reason," she said. Ed turned the hash in the pan. He did not say anything for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, a single crow landed on the garden fence and considered the frozen ground and flew away again without committing to anything. February crow. She knew how it felt. "Eat first," Ed said finally. "The arrestor will still be strange after breakfast." Biscuit shifted against the oven door, taking the warmth, and the kitchen held the smell of salt cod and bread and the particular comfort of a February morning that had not yet decided what it was going to be. Chapter 2. What the Cold Keeps. The medical examiner's preliminary note came through at 2:30 that afternoon. Not cardiac. Cole read it standing at his desk with his coat still on, which meant he had just come in from somewhere and had not yet decided whether the news warranted sitting down. Nora watched him from the doorway of the bullpen. The station was quiet at this hour. The desk officer had stepped out. The radio was doing its low, static murmur. The fluorescent light above Cole's desk had been flickering for 3 weeks, and nobody had replaced the tube yet. Small things that accumulated in a place where the work was mostly waiting between the moments that mattered. "Cyanide," he said. "Hydrogen cyanide, gas inhalation." He set the paper down. "Me notes bitter almond smell in the room. Cherry red lividity. She's ruling it suspicious pending full autopsy and toxicology." Hecht said cardiac. Hecht is a forensic liaison, not a medical examiner. Cole finally took his coat off and hung it on the rack. He did it with the deliberateness of a man buying himself a moment to think. He's also been notified. He was not pleased. Nora thought about the sealed room, the bolted door, the latched windows, the cold ash in the firebox, and the untouched bourbon, and Conrad Ashford in his chair with his hands in his lap. She thought about the bitter almond smell. She had not noticed it that morning, but she had been in the room hours after the fact, and HCN dispersed quickly in an uncontained space. By the time she arrived, it would have been gone entirely. "The room was sealed," she said. "I know the room was sealed. No cyanide compound in the food or drink. M.E. said so in the note." "She did." Cole sat down. "Ventilation system is next. County is sending a team back up this afternoon." He looked at her. "You photographed the firebox?" "Yes." "Anything in the firebox?" She thought about the ring of pale crystalline deposit at the far rear of the grate. She had photographed it. She had logged it as possible limescale. The same conclusion Hecht had reached before her. The two of them looking at the same thing and filing it under probably nothing. She had not been sure enough to say otherwise. "There's a residue on the stone floor at the back of the grate," she said. "Circular, about 4 centimeters across. I logged it as possible limescale." Hecht agreed. Cole looked at her for a moment. He had a way of waiting that was not impatience. It was the particular stillness of a man who had learned over 30 years that the next sentence was usually more useful than his own response to the previous one. "But," he said, "I'd like the lab to look at it specifically." He picked up the phone. She took that as a yes and went back to her desk. She spent the rest of the afternoon on paperwork, not the Ashford documentation which was already filed, but the ordinary accumulation of a patrol officer's week. A noise complaint on Birch Street that had resolved itself, a fender collision in the harbor master's parking lot that had not, a missing kayak that had turned up 3 coves north, which was where missing kayaks in Harrow Cove usually turned up. She processed each one with the methodical attention she brought to everything, transferring her handwritten notes to the official forms, signing and dating and filing in the correct order. Outside the station window, the February afternoon was doing what February afternoons did, failing early. The light going from flat to gray to gone with very little ceremony. The harbor darkening below the hill, the lobster boats already back at their moorings, and the dock lights coming on, one by one in the early dusk. She had grown up watching this harbor from various windows, and it still struck her sometimes the way a working harbor moved through its day with a kind of collective purpose. Each boat and buoy and dock in its place, the whole system ticking along, according to rhythms that had nothing to do with the deaths of difficult old men in locked rooms on the bluff. Conrad had watched this same harbor from a better angle every evening. 3 walls of glass, the Atlantic filling the room. She wondered what it had looked like to him, whether he had found it beautiful or merely familiar, or simply his, the way a man like Conrad seemed to categorize most things. Mine, not mine, worth fighting over. The county team returned to the cottage without her. She noted the time in her log. At 5 o'clock, she drove past the Lighthouse Road on her way home. She did not plan to stop. She was tired, and the day had shifted into something larger than a documentation assignment, and she wanted food and warmth and the particular quiet of the Graves house in the evening. But she slowed anyway as she passed the turnoff, the gravel spur visible for just a moment between the pines, the single Orange County tape tied between 2 trunks at the entrance, catching the last of the light. She pulled over on the shoulder and sat with the engine idling. The cottage was not visible from here, just the tape and the pines and the gravel disappearing into the dark between the trees. But she knew what was up there, the stone building, the decommissioned lighthouse above it, the study at the top with its 3 walls of winter sea and its cold hearth and its untouched bourbon. She thought about Conrad making the same drive every time he came home, turning off the main road onto the gravel, the cottage appearing between the pines. The particular isolation of choosing to live at the end of a road that no one else used. She thought about what it meant to know someone's routine well enough to build a death inside it. The tape moved in the coastal wind, a slow orange arc, and she watched it for a moment and then pulled back onto the road and drove. The Graves house was warm when she got home, the kitchen light on, the smell of something long cooked coming through the side door before she had it fully open. Ed was at the table with a map spread out in front of him, though she could not tell what it was a map of, and he folded it before she could look. She had stopped asking about the maps years ago. They appeared and disappeared like weather. Biscuit came over from his spot by the oven and put his chin on her knee, assessed the situation with the brown-eyed thoroughness of a beagle doing due diligence, and returned to the oven. She sat across from Ed. The kitchen settled around her, the faint tick of the burner, the smell of bay leaf and onion from the pot, the accumulated warmth of a room that had been occupied all day by a person and a dog who kept their own unhurried time. "The ventilation system will come back clean," she said. "There's no delivery mechanism they're going to find in the vents, or the food, or the drink." Ed got up and went to the stove. He lifted the lid on the pot, and the smell deepened something, with root vegetables and salt pork, something that had been patient all afternoon and was ready now. If not the ventilation and not the food, he said, then the room itself delivered it. Nora looked at the table where the map had been. The surface was clear now, just the wood grain and a faint ring from this morning's teacup. The firebox, she said. Ed set 2 bowls down and sat. He picked up his spoon and looked at her over the table, in the way he had not expectant, not prompting, simply present, waiting for whatever came next, at whatever speed it arrived. "Tell me about the firebox," he said. She told him about the residue, the 4-centimeter ring of pale crystalline deposit at the far rear of the grate, the new spark arrestor, clean steel in an old stone hearth, inconsistent with everything around it in the way that new things in old rooms always are, not wrong, just recent. And recently placed things in recently dead men's rooms had a way of deserving attention. Ed listened without interrupting. He ate in the unhurried way he did everything, the spoon moving steadily, his eyes on the bowl or the table or some middle distance that had nothing to do with the kitchen and everything to do with what she was describing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February dark had come down fully, and the glass had become a mirror. The two of them reflected in it at the table with their bowls. A small, bright room suspended in the middle of a cold and lightless night. The world beyond the glass reduced to nothing. "The man lit a fire every night," he said, finally. "That's what the housekeeper said. In the same room, in the same hearth." He looked at her. "And someone recently replaced the grate. 2 months ago, approximately. Based on the condition of the steel." Ed nodded slowly, the small, deliberate nod he used when something had confirmed rather than surprised him. "Who has been in that firebox in the last 2 months?" Nora thought about it. The housekeeper. Possibly Conrad himself. Though a man with Conrad's means and Conrad's difficulty did not typically clean his own hearth. Anyone who had visited the study and been alone in it long enough. Anyone who had been trusted, or who had made themselves appear trustworthy. In the specific vicinity of an old stone fireplace in a locked room at the top of a bluff. "That's the question," she said. "It's one of them," Ed said, and went back to his soup. The kitchen held them in its warmth, and the dark pressed against the glass from outside, and Biscuit slept against the oven door with the absolute confidence of a creature who had never once doubted that the warmth would continue. And Nora ate her soup and thought about a firebox and a new grate, and the shape of a question she did not yet have enough pieces to answer. Chapter 3. The Reasonable Man. Cole pulled the visitor log from the housekeeper the next morning. It was not a formal log. Conrad Ashford had not kept one. It was the housekeeper's memory, written out at Cole's request, in her careful, unhurried hand on 3 pages of a yellow legal pad. Agnes Pruitt, 71, 9 years in Conrad's employ, had given her account with the composure of someone who had decided that composure was the only useful thing she had left to offer. She had found him. She had climbed the stairs and knocked and gotten no answer, and used her key and climbed the narrower stairs to the study and found the bolt thrown and gone for the harbor master, and waited outside in the February cold for 20 minutes until someone came. She did not say any of this in her written account. She did not need to. It was in the handwriting, the letters, slightly larger than usual, the pen pressed a fraction harder into the page, the particular care of a person keeping themselves steady through the act of writing. 3 visitors in the 10 days before Conrad's death. Martin Telfer, Conrad's attorney. 2 days before, a routine estate review. Agnes said. He had been in the study for approximately 2 hours, with the door closed. He had left before dinner. A delivery from a wine merchant in Portland, 8 days before. Agnes had signed for it herself. No one had gone upstairs. Patrick Rowan, 3 days before. He had arrived mid-morning. He and Conrad had spoken in the front room initially. Then Conrad had taken a phone call and told Patrick to wait in the study. Patrick had been in the study alone for approximately 12 minutes before Conrad came back upstairs. Nora read the list twice. 12 minutes was not a long time. It was long enough to make a phone call, to scan a bookshelf, to stand at a window and look at the winter sea. It was also long enough to cross a room and crouch at a hearth, and place something in the far recess of a firebox behind a grate. If you knew what you were placing and where it needed to go, and had rehearsed the motion until it took less time than it should. Cole was watching her. Telfer's the obvious one. 2 hours. 2 days before. Door closed. No alibi problem yet, but we haven't asked. Patrick Rowan? Nora said, 12 minutes. 12 minutes alone in the study. Cole leaned back. The chair made the sound it always made, a low creak that had been present since before Nora joined the department, and that Cole had long since stopped hearing. Conrad's niece's husband, environmental engineer out of Portland. He came up to discuss a land boundary dispute Conrad was running against a neighboring property. He paused. The neighbor's land borders a wetlands mitigation site Rowan manages professionally. Nora set the legal pad down. She thought about the word professionally, the weight it carried in this context. A man whose livelihood depended on his professional standing, who managed regulatory compliance for a living, who understood better than most people what it meant to have that standing questioned. Conrad was pursuing a boundary dispute against land that Rowan has a professional connection to, she said. Apparently. And Rowan came up to discuss it. That's what he told Agnes. That's what Conrad told Agnes. For that matter, she said Conrad mentioned before the visit that his niece's husband was coming up about the property matter. Cole looked at her. Reasonable visit, on the record. No attempt to hide it. No, Nora said. No attempt to hide it at all. She called from her desk. Patrick Rowan answered on the second ring. She noted that too, not the first ring, which would have suggested he was waiting, and not the fourth or fifth, which would have suggested he was composing himself. The second ring was the answer of a man with a clear conscience, or a very well-prepared one. And she had learned, over the past year, that the two were harder to distinguish than they should be. His voice was even, professional, slightly careful in the way of someone who had spent years on the phone with regulatory agencies, accustomed to questions, practiced at answering them with exactly the information requested, and nothing additional. She told him she was following up on Conrad Ashford's death, that it was routine, that she had a few questions about his visit 3 days before. Of course, he said. Anything I can do to help. She asked him to describe the visit. He described it accurately. As far as she could tell, arriving mid-morning, the conversation in the front room about the boundary dispute, Conrad's phone call, waiting in the study, he mentioned the view, 3 walls of winter sea, he said, remarkable. He had not expected it. He mentioned Conrad's book collection, the range of it. He mentioned that Conrad had seemed in reasonable health, though perhaps more tired than usual. He offered this last detail with the careful sympathy of a man establishing that he had noticed nothing alarming, which was either honest or practiced, and she filed it and moved on. Were you in the study alone at any point? She asked. A pause. Brief. Natural. Most people paused before answering a question that implied they might have done something. It was the pause of a person locating the memory, placing themselves back in a room, accounting for their own movements. She had learned to measure pauses the way a carpenter measured wood, not obsessively, but with attention, because the difference between a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch mattered when you were trying to make something fit. For a few minutes, yes, while Conrad was on his call downstairs. Did you move around the room? I looked at the bookshelves. I stood at the window. Another pause, slightly longer than the first. Is there something specific you're asking about? Just building a picture of the room, Nora said. Did you go near the fireplace at all? Silence. 2 seconds. Perhaps 3. The silence of a man finding a word, or the silence of a man deciding which version of the truth to offer, and she could not yet tell which. And that inability was itself a kind of information. I don't think so. I may have glanced at it. It's a beautiful old hearth. It is, Nora said. Did you notice the spark arrestor on the grate? I'm not sure I know what that is. The mesh screen on the front of the grate. The one on that hearth looks recently replaced. I really couldn't say. I wasn't paying attention to the fireplace. His voice had not changed through any of it. Still even, still professional, still carrying that slight, practiced care. A man who was very good at sounding like a man with nothing to hide, which was either because he had nothing to hide or because he had hidden things before and knew what the performance required. She thanked him and said she might follow up. Of course, he said. Please don't hesitate. She sat at her desk for a moment after she hung up and looked at the harbor through the station window. The water was the same flat gray it had been all week, the same lobster boats at their moorings, the same dock lights, the same February light doing its usual nothing. A town going about its ordinary business on an ordinary Thursday, unaware that somewhere in a Portland office, an environmental engineer was sitting with a phone in his hand, and whatever it was that sat in a person's chest in the aftermath of a conversation like that one. She pulled up the county property records and started on the boundary dispute. The neighboring parcel was registered to a land trust with a Portland address. The wetlands mitigation site appeared in 2 separate regulatory filings, both listing the managing consultant as Rowan Environmental Services, LLC. Conrad had filed a formal boundary complaint 4 months ago. The complaint had escalated to a state-level review 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. She wrote the date down and looked at it. Then she thought about a man receiving news that his professional record was under state-level scrutiny and driving north a week later to discuss it with the man who had initiated that scrutiny. Coming into the study, waiting 12 minutes, standing at the window, looking at the winter sea, while his hands did something else entirely. She called the county lab and asked about the grate residue. The technician said he would need another day. She said that was fine. She wrote Patrick Rowan's name on a fresh page of her notepad, and below it wrote 12 minutes, and below that wrote the escalation date, and below that drew a line and left the rest of the page empty, because the rest of the page was where the proof would go when she had enough of it to write down. Outside the station window, the February light was doing its usual nothing. The harbor sat below the hill in the early afternoon gray, patient and cold and entirely itself. And Nora looked at it for a moment, and then looked back at the empty space below the line on her notepad, and picked up her pen and went back to work. Chapter 4. Estate Matters. Martin Telfer retained counsel on the morning of the 3rd day. Cole found out through the Rockland Bar Association, which was not the way he preferred to find things out. He told Nora about it standing in the doorway of the bullpen with his coffee, and the expression he wore when procedure was being observed in a way that made his job harder. The fluorescent tube above his desk had finally been replaced overnight, and the new light was slightly brighter than the old one, which made the office look less like itself, the way a familiar room always looks wrong for a day or two after something in it changes. He hasn't been formally questioned, Nora said. I know he hasn't. So he retained counsel before we asked him anything. Before I asked him anything, Cole said. You haven't asked him anything either. I'd like to. Cole looked at his coffee. He looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things when he was weighing something he had already decided. He drove up 2 days before Conrad died. 2 hours in the study with the door closed. Now he has a lawyer before we've knocked on his door. He looked at her. What does that tell you? That he has something to hide, Nora said. not necessarily about Conrad's death. Cole made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. He went back to his office. She heard his chair creak, and then the sound of him picking up his phone, and the particular silence that meant he was reading something rather than dialing. She spent the morning at her desk. The boundary dispute documentation took her 2 hours pulling the public filings. The state review initiation record, the name of the Augusta environmental law group Conrad had retained. She did not call them yet. She was building the shape of the thing in order, the way you built anything that needed to hold weight. Foundation first, then the structure above it, not the other way around. She thought about Telfer while she worked. 19 years as Conrad's personal attorney. The kind of professional relationship that outlasted marriages and business partnerships and most friendships built on discretion and utility and the particular trust of a man who had seen you handle his money and his secrets and his worst impulses and had kept coming back. 19 years was long enough to know where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking. It was also long enough to have accumulated obligations that had nothing to do with the client currently under investigation. At noon, she drove to Rockland. The drive took 40 minutes on the coastal route, the road following the water through a series of small towns that looked like Harrow Cove in the way that all small Maine coastal towns looked like each other at this time of year. The same gray water, the same bare trees, the same houses turned slightly inward against the cold, the same sense of a community that had drawn its perimeter and was waiting out the winter inside it. She had driven this road dozens of times, and it still held her attention. Not because it was beautiful in February, which it was not particularly, but because it was honest. The Maine coast in winter did not perform anything. It simply was what it was, cold and gray and continuous. And she had always found that easier to be around than the alternative. Telfer's office was on the second floor of a building 2 blocks from the Rockland waterfront, but grow up a narrow staircase with a worn runner and a brass nameplate on the door at the top. His assistant, a young man who had clearly been briefed and was not happy about it, showed her into a small conference room with a window that looked out over the parking lot, and brought her water she had not asked for, and left without making eye contact. She sat and waited. The conference room had the particular atmosphere of a room used for difficult conversations. Neutral colors, no personal items, a box of tissues on the credenza that had probably never been moved. A room designed to absorb whatever was brought into it without absorbing any of it permanently. Telfer came in 5 minutes later, a large man, 60-something, with the careful movements of someone managing a bad knee and the expression of someone who had decided exactly how cooperative he was going to be and intended to stay precisely there. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the measured attention of a man accustomed to assessing people across tables. "I understand you're assisting with the documentation review," he said. "That's right. I've been advised to keep this preliminary." "That's fine," Nora said. "I just have a few questions about your visit 2 days before Mr. Ashford's death." He described the visit in the careful terms of a man who had spent decades choosing words for a living, not lying. She could tell. But curating, selecting, the way a person edited a photograph, not by adding anything false, but by cropping out what they preferred not to show. Routine estate review, Conrad's holdings, his insurance, a review of the existing will. Nothing unusual. Conrad had been his usual self, precise, demanding, occasionally difficult, which Telfer delivered with the faint, dry emphasis of a man who had survived 19 years of it. "Did he mention the boundary dispute?" Nora asked. Something moved behind Telfer's eyes, brief, controlled, but present. "He mentioned it, yes." In what context? In the context of his estate planning. It was a pending legal matter. He paused. Conrad had a number of pending legal matters at any given time. Did he mention Patrick Rowan specifically? The pause this time was longer, long enough to be a decision rather than a recollection. I'd prefer not to get into the specifics of a privileged conversation. Mr. Rowan isn't your client. No, Telfer said. He isn't. They looked at each other across the table, the tissues on the credenza, the parking lot through the window, a gray rectangle of February sky above the roof lines. Somewhere below them, a door opened and closed, and the building absorbed it. Did Conrad mention any other business he was considering? Nora asked. He was always considering something. Telfer said, that was Conrad. She asked 3 more questions. He answered them in the same careful, limited way, never quite lying, never quite useful. Managing the conversation the way a good attorney managed a deposition, giving her the form of cooperation without the substance of it. When she stood to leave, he stood as well, the bad knee again, and walked her to the door with the slightly excessive courtesy of a man who wanted her to feel the meeting was over. In the stairwell, she paused. Mr. Telfer, she said, you retained counsel before we asked you anything. He looked at her from the doorway. The brass nameplate on the door behind him caught the stairwell light. I'm an attorney, Officer Callahan. Retaining counsel when a client dies under suspicious circumstances is standard practice. Is it standard practice when you're not the subject of the inquiry? He held her gaze for a moment. His hands were at his sides, the bad knee, the careful stillness of a large man being very deliberate about not moving. Have a safe drive back, he said, and closed the door. She sat in her car outside for a moment, with the engine idling and the Rockland waterfront visible at the end of the street. The same gray water, the same flat February light. A different harbor doing the same thing harbors did in winter, which was wait. Telfer was hiding something. That much was settled. What remained unsettled was whether what he was hiding had anything to do with Conrad's death, or whether it was something older and more private, the kind of secret that made careful men careful, without making them killers. She had met both kinds in the past year, and the exterior presentation was nearly identical. The difference was in what they were protecting and who it was for. She thought about 19 years. The things you accumulated in 19 years of handling someone's affairs. The obligations, the knowledge, the people who appeared in the files whose names were not the client's name. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward Harrow Cove, with the coastal road unspooling ahead of her, and the gray water on her left, and the bare trees on her right, and the particular February feeling of a case that was taking its time, that had not yet decided to give her what she needed, that was going to make her earn it the slow way, which was usually the only way worth having. Chapter 5. What the Lab Found. The county lab called at 8:10 on the 4th morning. Nora was at her desk with her first coffee when the technician, a different one from before, a woman named Marsh, who spoke in the clipped cadences of someone billing by the minute, told her the great residue results were back. Potassium salt deposit, consistent with the breakdown residue of potassium cyanide. Nora wrote it down. She looked at what she had written. Outside the station window, the harbor was doing its morning routine, the lobster boats heading out through the channel, the dock lights still on in the early gray. A herring gull sitting on the harbor master's roof with the patient, proprietary air of a creature that had decided this particular rooftop belonged to it. Ordinary morning, ordinary harbor. The words on her notepad were not ordinary. She thanked Marsh and hung up and walked to Cole's office and knocked on the open door. He read the note. He read it again. He was a man who read things twice when the first reading produced something he needed to be certain of, and she had learned to wait through the second reading without filling the silence. He set the note on his desk and looked at the window. "The firebox," he said. "Yes." The cyanide came from the firebox. "The residue is consistent with it. The ME found no compound in the food, the drink, or the ventilation. The firebox is the only remaining delivery point in a sealed room." Cole was quiet. The lobster boats were visible from his window, too, further along the channel now, moving toward open water. He watched them for a moment in the way that people in Harrow Cove sometimes watch the boats, not because they were interesting exactly, but because they were reliable. And reliability was its own kind of comfort when everything else in a room was uncertain. "A man who locks himself in his study every evening and lights a fire," he said. "Every evening, according to Agnes. Reliable as a clock. So whoever put it there knew the routine and had access to the firebox." Nora paused. "Alone and unobserved for long enough." Cole looked at her. 12 minutes. 12 minutes. He picked up his phone. "I'm calling Augusta. This is a homicide investigation as of now." He looked at her over the receiver. "You're still on documentation support." "I know. Hecht will not be pleased." Hecht was already not pleased. Cole almost smiled. It was the almost smile he produced when something was genuinely funny, but the circumstances did not permit him to acknowledge it fully. He dialed. She went back to her desk and pulled up everything she had on Patrick Rowan again. The professional record, the LLC incorporation, the wetlands mitigation filings. She had looked at these before as background. Now she looked at them as evidence, which was a different kind of looking, slower, more lateral, attending to the spaces between things as much as the things themselves. Rowan Environmental Services had filed compliance reports for a development client on a parcel adjacent to Conrad's boundary dispute. 7 years of reports. She pulled 2 from the public record database, annual wetlands mitigation compliance summaries. The dense regulatory language of a specialist writing for a board that trusted him to know what he was talking about and largely did not check. She was not a wetlands expert. She could not evaluate the technical claims, but she could read a document the way she read a room, looking for what was inconsistent, what was too smooth, what had the quality of something rehearsed rather than observed. The 2 reports were nearly identical in structure, not just in format, which was expected. Regulatory reports follow templates, but in language, phrases repeated verbatim across 7 years of supposedly independent assessments, numbers that varied in minor ways, while the surrounding analysis remained word for word the same. The particular flatness of a document that had been written once and adjusted at the margins rather than produced fresh from actual fieldwork. She was not certain. She needed someone who knew what they were looking at. She found the Augusta Environmental Law Group in the public filing record the firm Conrad had retained 6 weeks ago and sent the relevant pages to the lead attorney with a note explaining who she was and what she was looking at, and asking whether what she was seeing was normal practice or something else. The response came back in 40 minutes. "A single line, these reports have significant irregularities. Call me." She called. The attorney was a woman named Solberg, careful and measured in the way of someone who had learned that precision mattered more than speed. She told Nora that Conrad had brought the same reports to her attention 6 weeks ago, that she had been preparing a formal complaint to the State Regulatory Board, that the complaint would have been filed within 3 weeks. "What would the consequences have been for the consultant?" Nora asked. "License revocation," Solberg said. "Potentially criminal referral, depending on the financial benefit derived. 7 years of fraudulent fees is not a minor matter." How substantial were the fees? A brief pause. The pause of a person deciding whether a number was relevant enough to share or sensitive enough to withhold, and concluding it was both. Approximately $90,000. Nora looked at Patrick Rowan's name on her notepad. Did Mr. Ashford communicate any of this to the consultant directly? She asked. He told me he had, Solberg said. He said he informed the man personally. That was Conrad's preference. He wanted people to know it was coming. He felt it was more honest. Another pause, slightly different from the first. I sometimes thought it was more than honesty. I think Conrad wanted them to feel it arriving. Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about a man sitting across from Patrick Rowan in the front room of a stone cottage on a February morning, telling him clearly and deliberately that his license, his career, his professional existence was 3 weeks from ending. Watching him understand it, then taking a phone call downstairs and leaving him alone in the study above with the cold hearth and 12 minutes and whatever he had brought with him that morning in anticipation of exactly this. Thank you, she said. I may call again. Please do, Solberg said. Nora ended the call and sat at her desk with her coffee gone fully cold and the harbor outside the window and the morning progressing around her the way mornings did. The dock lights off now, the herring gull gone from the harbor master's roof, a delivery truck pulling up to the chandlery across the street with its hazard lights blinking orange in the gray. The shape of it was complete. Not the proof the shape, the 2 visits, the escalation timeline, the $90,000. Conrad telling Patrick directly, wanting him to feel it arriving. Patrick arriving 3 days later with something already prepared, knowing what 12 minutes alone in the study could accomplish if you used them correctly. She wrote it all down in order. She read it back. She crossed out one sentence that overstated what she actually knew and rewrote it more carefully. Because the difference between what she knew and what she believed mattered. And Cole would need to know which was which before this went any further up the chain. She put the notepad in her drawer and went to find him. He was still on the phone with Augusta. She waited in the doorway until he caught her eye and held up one finger. She nodded and leaned against the doorframe and looked out his window at the harbor. The channel empty now, the boats gone, the water flat and gray and patient in the February morning. She thought about Conrad wanting people to feel it arriving. She thought about Patrick Rowan on the drive north, the capsule already prepared, knowing exactly what was waiting at the end of the lighthouse road. Cole hung up and looked at her. Tell me, he said. She told him. Chapter 6. Salt Cod and Hard Questions. Ed was already at the stove when she came in that evening. Salt cod hash in the pan, bread on the board. The kitchen carrying the particular weight of a February evening that had settled in for the night and was not going anywhere. The windows dark, the outdoor thermometer on the sill outside reading 4 degrees. The kind of cold that made the house feel not just warm, but deliberate. A warmth that had been built and maintained against something specific, rather than simply existing by default. Biscuit was pressed against the base of the oven door, taking the warmth with the focused dedication of a creature who had identified the best available position and intended to hold it. He opened one eye when Nora came through the side door, decided the situation did not require both, and closed it again. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. The hook was full of her coat, Ed's heavy wool overcoat from sometime in the previous decade, a canvas jacket she had left here in October and never retrieved, a spare leash for Biscuit that lived on the hook more than it lived anywhere else. The particular accumulation of a shared house, things finding their places over years without anyone deciding they should go there. She sat at the table. She did not speak immediately. Ed cooked without turning around, the hash moving in the pan with a low, steady sound, and the kitchen held them both in its way the tick of the burner, the smell of salt cod and rendered fat, and the bread going golden on the board. The radio on the counter playing something quiet that she was not paying enough attention to identify. She had sat at this table through most of the significant events of her adult life, and before that, the significant events of her childhood. And the table had absorbed all of it without comment, and was still here, solid and scarred and exactly itself. "The lab came back," she said finally. "I heard." She looked at him. His back was to her, the hash moving in the pan, his posture the same as it always was, straight, unhurried, the posture of a man who had long since stopped needing to signal anything to anyone. From whom? "Agnes Pruitt does her shopping on Thursdays," Ed said. "The pharmacy is next to the diner." He turned to the hash. "People talk. Potassium salt residue, consistent with potassium cyanide breakdown." He said it the way he sometimes said things she had not yet told him, not as a guess, not as a demonstration, but as a confirmation, as though the information had arrived through channels she did not have access to, and he was simply acknowledging receipt. She had stopped being surprised by this years ago. He plated the hash and set it in front of her, and sat across with his own, and poured 2 cups of tea from the pot already on the table. She did not ask when he had made it. He always had tea ready when she came in the evening. On the days she came, which was most days, which meant he kept it warm on the chance, and she had never once arrived to find it cold. She told him about Solberg, the compliance reports, the 7 years of fraudulent filings, the $90,000, and the 3-week timeline, and the particular detail that had stayed with her all afternoon. Conrad telling Patrick directly, wanting him to feel it arriving, sitting across from him in the front room of the cottage on a gray February morning, and making certain he understood exactly what was coming and when. Ed listened. He ate with the same steadiness he brought to everything, the spoon moving without hurry, his eyes on the bowl or the table, or the particular middle distance he occupied when he was thinking. He did not nod along. He did not make the small sounds of engagement that most people made to signal they were following. He simply listened, completely, the way she imagined he had once listened to things that mattered considerably more than a murder in a coastal town, in rooms she would never see, with people whose names had never been written down. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The hash pan ticked on the cooling burner. Biscuit shifted against the oven door, redistributing his weight with the careful precision of a dog who had spent 8 years perfecting the geometry of warmth. "A man who keeps a fire burning every night in the same room," Ed said, "doesn't replace the grate unless something convinced him he had to." He looked up at her. What made him look into the firebox? Nora set her fork down. She had been so fixed on the second visit, the 12 minutes, the capsule, the mechanism, that she had not gone back far enough. The spark arrestor was 2 months old. The steel had told her that. And Agnes, when Nora had asked about recent maintenance work, had mentioned a first visit, earlier, before the boundary dispute had escalated. When Patrick had come up under the pretext of a safety concern about the old grate, had pointed to it, had explained the hazard, had offered to replace it while he was there. Conrad had watched him do it. "He was in the firebox 2 months ago," she said. "First visit. Safety concern about the old arrestor. Conrad let him replace it." Ed nodded slowly. Conrad watched him. "Yes." "Trusted him to do it correctly." "Yes." Ed picked up his tea. He held it in both hands the way he did on cold evenings, not drinking yet, just holding. "So the first visit established the access, the legitimate reason to have been inside the firebox, and the second visit used what the first visit created." Nora looked at her hash. She had eaten half of it without noticing. He planned it 2 months in advance. Before the first visit, he already knew the geometry of the room. He knew the hearth. He knew the recess behind the grate. Did he know 2 months ago that Conrad was going to file the complaint? She thought about it. Solberg had said Conrad retained the firm 6 weeks ago, But Conrad had told Patrick directly, and Conrad, by Soulbert's account, was not a man who retained lawyers quietly and waited. He was a man who wanted you to feel it arriving. He could have told him 8, 10 weeks ago, she said, before the first visit, before the new arrestor. A man like Conrad, Ed said, would not make a phone call to his lawyer and then sit on it. He would have told Patrick as soon as he decided. He set his cup down, possibly before he told his lawyer. So Patrick knew, came up with the pretext, put himself inside the firebox with a legitimate reason to be there, replaced the arrestor, left Conrad with a new grate and no reason to think about the hearth again. She paused, then came back 3 days before the death and used 12 minutes. Ed looked at her steadily across the table. The kitchen light caught the lines of his face, the particular weathering of a man who had spent decades in conditions that left their mark, though he never described what those conditions had been, and she had learned not to ask directly. The first visit gave him the geography, he said. The second visit was the act. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February night was absolute. No wind, no sound. The cold having settled into a stillness that felt less like weather and more like the world having stopped briefly to consider something. "I need the latch," she said. Ed looked at her. "Tell me about the latch," she told him. The north-facing panel, the play in the lever when she pressed it sideways, that slight, almost imperceptible tolerance that the other 2 latches did not have. The frost pattern in the lower housing, denser than the condensation on the adjacent glass, extending further up the frame. A localized pattern that she had photographed and logged and filed under things she did not yet understand. Ed listened. He looked at the table while she described it, the same looking at the table that was not seeing the table at all, but something arranged behind it. Some configuration of pieces that had not yet become a picture. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You said the room was genuinely sealed," he said. "Every latch thrown, bolt on the door from the inside." "And Patrick was in Portland?" "Confirmed. The bolt on the door Conrad threw himself," Ed said. "His own hand." "Yes. And the latches, all 3, from the inside." Ed looked up from the table. He looked at her the way he sometimes did when he was deciding how much to give her and had settled on less than she wanted. "The latch," he said, "is the last piece. When you understand what was in that housing, you'll have all of it." She looked at him. "You know what it is." "I have a thought," he said, "but it's your case, Nora, and you're not there yet." She had wanted to push 100 times over the past year and had learned each time that pushing Ed produced the same question asked from a slightly different angle. He would not give her the answer. He never did. And the restraint was not cruelty. It was the opposite. The deep patience of a man who understood that an answer given was worth less than an answer reached, and who had decided years ago that this was the gift he had to offer. She finished her hash. She drank her tea. She said good night to Biscuit, who produced a single, slow tail thump against the oven door without opening his eyes, which was as much acknowledgement as he ever offered at this hour, and was, she had decided, a form of affection. She put on her coat at the hook by the door. Ed was already clearing the table, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who had lived alone long enough that the small household tasks had become as automatic as breathing. "The distilled water," she said, from the door. Ed stopped. He looked at her. "If you were going to make ice," she said slowly, "and you didn't want the ice to leave a trace mineral content, salt content, anything the lab could identify as distinct from natural condensation, you'd use distilled water. Ed set the bowl in his hands down on the counter. He was very still. The latch housing, she said. The frost pattern. Localized melt and refreeze rather than passive condensation. She looked at him. Something was in there. Something made of ice. Something that held the lever in a half-engaged position, and then, when the room cooled after the fire died, the surrounding moisture refroze around it and completed the lock. The kitchen was very quiet. The burner had been off for 20 minutes, and the pan had gone fully cold. And Biscuit had not moved. And outside the window, the February night pressed against the glass and showed them both their own reflections, standing in a warm kitchen at the end of a long day. The answer arriving not with any drama, but with the particular quiet of something that had been true all along, and was only now being seen. Ed looked at her for a long moment. "There it is," he said. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she went out into the February cold and drove home with the heater running and the latch mechanism fully assembled in her mind. Every piece in its place. The room sealing itself around a dead man, while its architect drove south on the interstate, with clean hands and an alibi, and the knowledge that February in Maine was cold enough and long enough to do the rest of the work for him. Chapter 7. The Bluff Road. She drove up the Lighthouse Road on a Thursday afternoon without telling Cole, not because she was hiding it, because there was nothing to report. Yet the distilled water result had not come back. The Augusta call was still processing. And what she had was a mechanism she understood and a proof she did not yet have, which were two different things, and Cole needed the latter before she put any of this in front of him formally. She was not going up there to find evidence. She was going because the room was still working on her, the north window specifically, the frost pattern in the latch housing, and she had learned over the past year that some questions only resolved themselves when you went back and stood in the place they had come from. She parked at the turnoff and walked the gravel spur rather than drive. The county tape was still at the entrance. The orange ribbon faded slightly from 2 weeks of February weather, moving in the coastal wind with a slow, indifferent arc. She ducked under it and walked between the pines, the frozen gravel hard under her boots, the trees holding their winter silence on either side. A crow somewhere further in the woods made a single sound and did not repeat it. She did not go inside. She stood on the bluff side of the cottage and looked up at the north-facing window of the study, 2 stories up, the glass carrying the usual exterior frost crust, a thin white layer deposited by 2 weeks of coastal freeze and thaw and freeze again. Indistinguishable from any other winter window on any other stone building on the Maine coast. From out here, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. That was the point. That had always been the point. The wind off the Atlantic found the gap between her collar and her hat, and she pulled the collar up and stood with her hands in her pockets and looked at the window. She thought about water. Specifically, she thought about what water did in cold conditions. The transitions it made, liquid to solid to liquid, the precise temperatures at which each occurred, the ways the process could be controlled and predicted by someone who understood it professionally. An environmental engineer spent years learning the behavior of water in landscapes, in soil, in seasonal cycles. Patrick Rowan would know, with the precision of training and practice, exactly how thick an ice structure needed to be to survive 3 days in an unheated stone recess, exactly how small it needed to be to fit inside a latch housing, exactly what temperature differential would cause the surrounding moisture to refreeze around it, completing the lock, making it indistinguishable from the natural frost that February deposited on every surface in a stone cottage on the Maine coast. He had used his expertise the way a carpenter used a specific tool, not generally, not approximately, but with the exact knowledge of what the material could do and what it could not, and where the tolerances were. She looked at the exterior frost on the north panel. The morning of the discovery. Hecht had noted the exterior ice as expected undisturbed overnight freeze, consistent with natural formation. He had been right about that. The exterior was genuine. It was the interior that had been different. The frost in the latch housing denser and more localized than passive condensation produced, extending further up the frame in the particular pattern of a melt and refreeze rather than a slow deposit. She had photographed it. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. The wind pushed at her again, and she turned her face toward the Atlantic and looked out at the water. This time of day, this time of year, the sea was a deep and specific gray, not flat. Exactly, but without texture. The surface moving in the way that cold water moved, heavily, without much enthusiasm for it. The horizon was a clean line where the gray of the sea met the gray of the sky, and the line was so sharp and so continuous that it looked less like a natural boundary and more like something drawn. Conrad had looked at this view every evening from the room above her, poured his bourbon, lit his fire, thrown the bolt. The ritual of a man who had arranged his life around solitude and maintained it with the same litigious precision he brought to everything else. Nobody liked him much. Several people owed him money. A few people hated him specifically. One person had done something about it. She thought about Patrick Rowan driving north on the morning of the second visit. The capsule already prepared, the ice shell formed over the potassium cyanide solution, shaped and sized to sit flush against the back of the grate, thick enough to survive 3 days in the cold recess. The ice wedge for the latch housing, smaller, precisely shaped, carried separately. The whole apparatus constructed in advance with the patience of a man who had decided and then taken his time deciding correctly. He had driven the same road she had driven this morning, turned off onto the gravel spur, seen the cottage appear between the pines, gone inside, talked to Conrad in the front room about the boundary dispute, about the land, about the professional matter they were ostensibly there to discuss, while Conrad's phone was already ringing downstairs. 12 minutes. She imagined the study empty of Conrad, the winter sea through 3 walls of glass, the cold hearth, the aged stone. Patrick crossing the room, crouching at the firebox. The particular stillness required of a person doing something that could not be undone, that was already in motion from the moment they drove north that morning, that had been in motion, arguably, from the moment Conrad sat across from him weeks earlier and told him what was coming and made certain he felt it arriving. She stood on the bluff until the cold became unreasonable, which in February took less time than it should. Then she walked back down the gravel spur to her car and sat with the engine running and the heater working at the temperature that had settled into her coat and her boots during the walk. She pulled out her phone and called the county lab. Marsh answered on the 3rd ring. Nora asked whether in the documentation of the north window latch there had been any analysis of the residual moisture or ice in the latch housing itself. The sound of typing. A pause. More typing. The latch was photographed and swabbed as part of the secondary site pass, Marsh said. Swab results. More typing. The particular rhythm of someone navigating a database they knew well. Distilled water. No mineral content. No organic content. Nora looked through the windshield at the pines. A light coastal wind moved through them, and they moved back. The small, involuntary movement of trees in winter, and then were still again. Distilled water, not groundwater, not the coastal condensation that would have accumulated mineral traces from the salt air. The particular mineral signature of this specific stretch of Maine coastline. Detectable in the lab. identifiable as natural, pure water, the kind produced specifically to leave no chemical record, the kind used when you needed ice that would disappear completely and leave nothing behind except the one thing you had not anticipated, the absence of what should have been there. Natural frost left minerals. This had left none. She sat with that for a moment. Then she called Cole. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting for something and had decided her number was the most likely source of it. She told him about the distilled water result. She told him about the mechanism, the ice wedge in the latch housing, the half-engaged lever, the refreeze completing the lock after the fire died. She told him about Patrick's professional expertise, the precision it would have required, the specific knowledge of water behavior in cold conditions that an environmental engineer would have, and a property attorney or a retired shipyard foreman would not. Cole was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "The room sealed itself," he said. "Yes, Patrick was already in Portland. Conrad bolted the door himself. The latch completed on its own as the temperature dropped." She paused. "He built an alibi out of physics." Another silence. Outside the car, the coastal wind had picked up slightly, the pines moving more continuously now. The Orange County tape at the turnoff, visible in her rear-view mirror, lifting and settling and lifting again. "I need this in a formal report by 8 tomorrow morning." Cole said, "Everything, the mechanism, the distilled water, the timeline, Solberg, the compliance reports, all of it." A pause. "And then I'm calling Augusta, and we're going to Portland." She said she would have it ready. She ended the call and sat for another moment with the engine idling and the heater running and the lighthouse road empty in both directions. The gravel spur disappearing into the pines on her right, the bluff road continuing northeast toward the point where the decommissioned lighthouse stood dark against the February sky. Then she pulled out onto the road and drove back to town. Because she had a report to write, and the February dark came early, and she wanted to be home before it did. Chapter 8. Douglas Crane. Cole listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. She laid it out in order at his desk on Friday morning. The report was already in front of him. She had finished it at 10:30 the previous night, at the kitchen table in the Graves house, Ed long since in bed, Biscuit relocated from the oven door to somewhere upstairs. The house quiet around her in the way it was quiet late at night. A different quiet from the daytime, more deliberate, as though the house itself had decided to concentrate. She had written the report in the same order she had assembled the case, foundation first, then the structure above it, and reading it back before she printed it, she had felt the particular satisfaction of something that held its own weight. Cole had read it before she arrived. She could tell from the way he sat when she came in, not picking it up, not referring to it, but occasionally glancing at a specific page, the way a person glanced at a map they had already memorized, checking a detail they already knew. She walked him through it verbally anyway. The 2 visits, the spark arrestor installed 2 months prior, the pretext of a safety concern, Patrick unobserved inside the firebox with a legitimate reason to be there, the ice capsule, the potassium cyanide solution, enclosed in a water ice shell, shaped to sit flush against the back grate, thick enough to survive 3 days in the cold recess of an unheated study. Conrad's nightly fire as the activation mechanism, reliable as a clock. The gas filling the sealed room while Conrad sat in his chair with his bourbon untouched and the winter sea filling 3 walls of glass around him. The gas dispersing up the flue within 2 hours, leaving the potassium salt residue as the only physical trace. Then the latch. The ice wedge in the north panel housing, shaped to half engage the lever. The room cooling after the fire died. The surrounding moisture refreezing and completing the lock. The distilled water, no mineral content, no organic content. the specific absence of what natural condensation would have left behind. Then the timeline. The $90,000. Solbar. Conrad telling Patrick directly, wanting him to feel it arriving. Patrick arriving 3 days later with the mechanism already prepared. When she finished, Cole looked at the window. The harbor was doing its morning routine below the hill. The boats already out, the dock lights off, the water flat and gray in the early light. He watched it for a moment with the expression he wore when he was not watching it at all, but thinking through something in the foreground of his mind, using the harbor as a kind of neutral background. The distilled water is the clearest physical link, he said. Yes. Everything else is circumstantial. Yes, but the mechanism is complete. Every piece has a physical explanation. There is no other delivery point in a sealed room, and no other person with unobserved access to the firebox in the relevant window. The distilled water puts deliberate construction in the latch housing. The potassium salt puts cyanide in the firebox. Patrick's professional expertise makes him the only person in the suspect pool capable of designing both. Cole was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen and set it down. Telfer had 2 hours in that study. Telfer is an estate attorney. No chemistry background, no technical knowledge of water behavior in cold conditions. No professional connection to the boundary dispute beyond managing Conrad's affairs. She paused. His access to the firebox is possible in the abstract. His knowledge of the mechanism is not. Augusta will want Telfer resolved before the warrant application goes forward. Cole looked at her. You said last week you thought he was protecting someone rather than himself. I think there's a name in Conrad's correspondence, she said. A civil fraud claim Conrad was preparing against a former business associate from the Bath shipyard days. If that associate is connected to Telfer personally, not professionally, personally, it explains Telfer's behavior without implicating him in the death. Name? I don't have it yet, but Agnes mentioned Conrad had a file on the matter in his desk. The correspondence would be in the estate inventory. Cole nodded. He reached for his phone. I'll get the inventory from the Rockland probate office. You take the morning. If there's a name in that correspondence, I want it before noon. The name was Douglas Crane. She found it in the estate inventory by 10 o'clock, a file labeled Bath Correspondence, 1995 through present, flagged for legal review. The probate clerk read her the relevant entries over the phone. A dry dock contract settlement from 1998, a discrepancy of $14,000, Conrad's notation held in reserve, and then, recently, a separate notation in different ink, more deliberate, refer to Augusta. Douglas Crane, 70 years old, retired shipyard foreman, Bath. She looked the name up, found him in 3 places the Bath City Directory, an old union roster from the shipyard, and a single line in Martin Telfer's publicly available professional biography, survived by his wife, Margaret, née Telfer. Margaret Telfer, Martin Telfer's sister, dead 6 years. She drove to Bath. The drive took 50 minutes on the inland route, away from the coast, through the kind of Maine landscape that tourists did not photograph. Flat pine forest interrupted by the occasional cleared lot. A gas station. A collapsed barn still standing through sheer structural stubbornness. The low sky pressing down on all of it, with the particular February commitment to being unremarkable. She had driven this route twice before, years ago, for reasons she could not now recall, and it looked exactly the same as it had then, which was somehow reassuring. A landscape that did not bother changing because it had already decided what it was. Douglas Crane lived on a residential street 3 blocks from the Bath waterfront, in a small house that had been carefully maintained for 40 years and had recently begun losing the argument. The porch railing needed paint. The storm door had a crack in the lower panel held with electrical tape applied precisely. The tape cut straight and laid flat, not the tape of a person who had stopped caring, but the tape of a person managing more than they could reasonably manage, and doing it as neatly as possible. He answered before she knocked a second time. A tall man, thinner now than he had probably been for most of his life, with careful eyes and the unhurried movements of someone who had been expecting a visit like this, and had decided, somewhere between expecting it and answering the door, how he was going to handle it. "Officer Callahan," she said. "I know who you are," Douglas Crane said. "Come in." The inside of the house was the inside of a life lived in the same place for a long time. The furniture worn to the exact shape of its owner's preferences. The walls holding photographs in frames that had not been moved in years. The kitchen smelling of coffee made hours ago and not yet cleared away. A house that had once held more people than it currently did and had not quite adjusted to the reduction, the way houses sometimes didn't. He put the kettle on without asking. She sat at the kitchen table. It was smaller than Ed's and less cluttered, and had the particular quality of a room where someone ate alone and had stopped pretending otherwise. "Martin called me," Crane said, from the stove, "when Conrad died. He said someone would come, eventually." He was right. He usually is. Crane brought 2 cups and sat across from her. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her directly, with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was following through on it, the particular relief of someone who had been carrying something for long enough that setting it down felt better than holding it, even if setting it down had consequences. "The fraud was real," he said. "Minor and old, but real. 1998. Conrad and I were settling accounts on a dry dock contract, and I moved $14,000 through the wrong column. Conrad knew at the time. He chose not to act on it then." He paused. He saved it. That was Conrad's way. He saved things, information, grievances, leverage. He kept them in reserve until they were useful. And recently they became useful. Nora said, "The boundary dispute gave him an occasion." Crane looked at his cup. "Or maybe he just decided, at 67, that he was running out of time to collect on everything he was owed." A brief pause. "Martin told him the statute of limitations was complicated, that pursuing it would cost more in legal fees than Conrad would recover, that I was 70 years old and retired, and it served no practical purpose." He looked up. "Conrad told Martin to file it anyway, or find a new attorney." "And Martin?" "Martin told me." Crane set his cup down. He looked at her steadily. "He has been my brother-in-law for 34 years. His sister was my wife. She passed 6 years ago." A silence, brief, complete. The silence of a man acknowledging a fact that had not stopped being true just because time had passed. "He has been protecting me since before that, in the ways that men do, quietly, without making anything of it. I don't deserve it particularly, but that's what he's been doing, and that's what he was doing when Conrad died." Nora looked at him. The kitchen light was the flat light of a winter morning through a north-facing window, the kind of light that showed everything without flattering anything. The careful tape on the storm door visible from here, the worn edges of the chair he was sitting in, the 2 cups of tea neither of them had drunk. "Did you go to the cottage?" she asked. "In the days before Conrad died?" "No." Without hesitation, without the slight internal adjustment that preceded a decision about what to say. Simply, no. Immediate and complete. The answer of a man with nothing to arrange. "You haven't been to Harrow Cove?" "Not in 4 years. Not since before Margaret died. Conrad and I had not spoken in 2. She believed him. She believed him the way she had learned, over the past year, to believe certain things not from sentiment, not from liking the person, but from the particular quality of an answer that had no architecture to it, no construction, just the flat fact of itself, delivered without effort. She asked 3 more questions. He answered all of them the same way, directly, without hesitation, with the exhausted honesty of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had decided that the weight of it was no longer worth the privacy it purchased. She drove back toward Harrow Cove in the early afternoon, with the inland route unwinding ahead of her and the low February sky pressing down on the pine forest, and Douglas Crane's kitchen still present in her mind, the worn chair, the untouched tea, the careful tape on the storm door, the photograph on the wall nearest the door that she had not looked at directly, but had seen in the way you saw things at the edge of your attention. A woman and a man, younger than they had been recently, standing somewhere in summer light. She called Cole from the car. He listened. When she finished, he said he would note it in the file and that Telfer was resolved, and that she should be at the station at 8 the following morning when the call to Augusta went through for the warrant. She said she would be there. She drove the rest of the way in the particular quiet of a case that had just closed one door and was standing in front of another, the larger one, the one that had been there from the beginning. Martin Telfer had been protecting a tired old man from an unnecessary legal fight. He had not been protecting himself. It was not the same as guilt. From the outside, in the early stages, with the right light and the right angle and a 19-year professional relationship to a dead man, it had looked exactly the same. She thought about the difference all the way home. Chapter 9. The Ice in the Latch. The warrant came through on Saturday morning, Cole told her at 8 o'clock, standing in the doorway of the bullpen with his coat already on, which meant Augusta had called earlier than expected, and he had come in before the station was properly open and had been waiting. The fluorescent light above his desk was doing its steady, reliable work, the new tube still slightly brighter than the old one, the office still not quite adjusted to it. Financial records, he said. Phone records. The Augusta Environmental Board is opening a parallel inquiry into the compliance reports. Solberg has been notified. He looked at her. Portland PD will execute at Rowan's office this afternoon. We're going down Monday for the interview. Nora nodded. You're still documentation support, Cole said. I know. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression he wore when he was about to say something he had been considering for longer than the conversation suggested. You found the arrestor on the first walk-through, he said, before we knew it was a homicide, before Hecht knew, before anyone knew anything except that a difficult old man was dead in a locked room. She waited. That's good work, he said. And then he went back to his office. Because Cole was not a man who elaborated on a thing after he had said it, and the saying of it was the whole of what he intended. She sat at her desk and looked at the harbor for a moment. The Saturday morning harbor was quieter than the weekday version, fewer boats moving, the dock activity reduced to a couple of figures in heavy coats doing something unhurried at the far end of the commercial pier. A gray morning, the water dark and still, the kind of February Saturday that felt less like a day off and more like the week simply continuing in a lower register. She thought about Monday, about sitting across a table from Patrick Rowan with Cole beside her and the warrant executed and the financial records in front of them, the $90,000 laid out in whatever form the records took, invoices, transfers, the paper trail of 7 years of careful, patient fraud. She thought about his voice on the phone, even and professional and slightly careful. She thought about the 2 seconds of silence before he answered her question about the spark arrestor. She thought about the north window, She had understood the mechanism since Thursday evening in Ed's kitchen. She had the distilled water result. She had the potassium salt residue. She had the timeline and the motive and the 2 visits and the 12 minutes. What she did not yet have, and what Monday's interview would not directly provide, was the specific physical evidence that placed the ice wedge in the latch, housing the proof that what was in there had been deliberately constructed rather than naturally deposited. The distilled water was the closest thing to that proof. Natural condensation left minerals. This had not. The absence was the evidence, which was the kind of evidence that was real and persuasive, and also the kind that a good defense attorney would spend considerable energy complicating. She pulled up the lab report again and read through it carefully, looking for language she might have missed, details that had not seemed significant before and might now. She found it in the supplementary notes at the bottom of the swab analysis, a single line that Marsh had included without comment. The kind of detail a thorough technician logged because thoroughness was its own justification, regardless of whether anyone would ever need it. Swab location interior latch housing, north panel. Sample collected from lower lever contact point. Note, sample volume unusually high for passive condensation, consistent with localized liquid accumulation prior to freezing. She read it twice. Unusually high volume. Not the thin film of condensation that cold glass deposited passively over a winter night. A volume of water that suggested something had been present in the housing, something that had held water, that had released it slowly as the room cooled, that had left behind more moisture than the surface alone could account for. An ice structure, melting, pooling at the base of the housing before the temperature dropped far enough to refreeze it solid. She printed the supplementary note and walked to Cole's office and set it on his desk without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. It held water, he said. More than passive condensation accounts for. Something was there and melted and refroze around the lever. She paused. It's not a confession, but it's physical evidence of deliberate construction, not natural formation. Cole looked at the note for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone and called the Augusta liaison and read the supplementary note aloud, slowly and completely, and listened to the response. When he hung up, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been told something that changed the weight of what he was carrying. They want this in the warrant supplement before Monday, he said. You'll need to write it up today. I can have it by noon. Good. He looked at the note again. Localized liquid accumulation prior to freezing, he said, almost to himself. The man built a lock out of water and cold air and trusted February to finish the job. February in Maine, Nora said. He knew what he was working with. She spent the morning writing the warrant supplement. It was careful, precise work, translating the physical evidence into language that would survive scrutiny, that would not overstate what the lab results actually showed, that would present the mechanism clearly enough that someone who had never stood in a cold stone study on a Maine bluff in February could nonetheless understand what had happened there. She wrote it the way she wrote everything in order, without decoration, saying exactly what the evidence supported and nothing beyond it. At noon she sent it to Cole and put on her coat and walked down to the harbor. She did not do this often walk without purpose, without a destination, without a reason that could be logged or reported. But the morning had been long and the supplement was done, and she wanted the cold air and the sound of the water before she went back to the station for whatever the afternoon brought. The harbor in February had its own particular quality, reduced inward, the summer version of itself stripped away to the functional core. No tourists, no kayak rentals, no one eating ice cream on the dock, just the boats at their moorings and the gulls doing their gull business and the water moving in the way cold water moved, heavily, without much enthusiasm. the surface catching the flat midday light and giving very little back. She stood at the end of the public pier for a few minutes, with her hands in her pockets, and the wind finding the gap between her collar and her hat, and the harbor laid out in front of her. The working harbor, the real harbor, the one that was here in February when everything else had gone somewhere warmer. She thought about Conrad watching this same water from a better angle, the winter sea through 3 walls of glass, every evening. The ritual of a man who had arranged everything around his own preferences and enforced those arrangements with the same litigious precision he brought to everything else. Nobody liked him much. Several people owed him money. One person had decided that precision could work both ways. She turned and walked back up the hill to the station. The afternoon brought the Portland PD execution confirmation. The warrant served at Rowan Environmental Services at 2:15. The financial records seized. Patrick Rowan, present and cooperative in the specific way of a man whose attorney had told him that cooperative was the only available posture. He had made no statement. He had asked no questions. He had, by the Portland PD account, been very still. Cole told her this at 4 o'clock, reading from the confirmation email with his coat still on again, though this time it meant he had just come back from somewhere rather than that he was going. Still, Nora said. That's what they said. Very still. She thought about the 2 seconds of silence on the phone, the even voice, the professional care, a man who was very good at being very still while things moved around him, which was a useful quality in an environmental engineer navigating regulatory agencies, and a useful quality in a person who had built a death inside someone else's routine, and then driven 2 hours south and waited for February to do the rest. Monday, Cole said. Monday, she said. She drove to Ed's that evening because it was Friday, and because the supplement was done and the warrant was executed, and Monday was 2 days away, and the particular suspension of a case that was assembled but not yet closed was easier to sit with in a warm kitchen than in an empty apartment. Ed was at the table when she came in, not cooking, just sitting with a cup of tea and the folded newspaper and biscuit at his feet. The beagle sprawled on the kitchen floor in the loose-limbed way of a dog who had given up the pretense of alertness for the evening. She hung her coat and sat across from him. The warrant came through, she said. Ed nodded. He looked at her over his cup. And Monday, we go to Portland. He nodded again. He looked at his tea. Outside the kitchen window, the February night had come down fully, the outdoor thermometer reading 6 degrees. The world beyond the glass reduced to its own reflection. The 2 of them at the table, the kitchen light. Biscuit, a dark shape at Ed's feet. The latch, Ed said. The lab found unusually high moisture volume in the housing, she said. More than passive condensation accounts for. Something was there. It melted and refroze, and the volume it left behind is the physical record of it. Ed was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in the way he sometimes did at the end of a long case, not with the satisfaction of a solved puzzle, because he did not treat these things as puzzles, but with the particular attentiveness of a man taking stock of what had been found and what it meant, and what the finding had cost, which was not always the same as what the case had cost. You saw the arrestor on the first walk, he said, before anyone told you to look. Yes. And the latch? Yes. And the frost pattern. He paused. All of it on the first walk, before you had any reason to think it was anything other than a difficult old man dying in a locked room. She looked at him. He was not flattering her. Ed did not flatter. He was accounting for something, adding it up in the careful way he added things up. You looked at the room, he said, the way the room needed to be looked at. She did not say anything. Outside the window, the cold pressed against the glass, and the kitchen held its warmth against it, and Biscuit slept at Ed's feet, and the tea in both their cups had gone slightly cool, the way tea did when the conversation was more important than the drinking of it. "Monday," she said finally. "Monday," Ed said, and picked up his cup. Chapter 10. The Warmth That Stays. They drove to Portland on Monday morning. Cole drove. Nora sat with the case file in her lap and watched the Maine coastline give way to the inland route south, the pine forest. The flat, gray sky, the occasional town appearing and receding with the particular brevity of things seen from a moving car on a winter morning. The heater ran steadily. Cole drank his coffee from a travel cup and said nothing for the first 40 minutes, which was not unusual. Cole was a man who treated silence in a moving car the way he treated silence in an interview room, as a condition with its own utility, not something to be filled reflexively. She thought about the room. She had been thinking about the room for 2 weeks. The north window, the hearth, the untouched bourbon, the 3 walls of winter sea. She had stood in it twice now, once on the morning of the discovery, and once in her mind, reconstructing it from the outside on the bluff road with the coastal wind in her collar and the frost on the glass catching the flat February light. She knew the room well enough that she could have drawn it from memory, the placement of the armchair, the distance from the hearth to the north window, the exact position of the grate in the firebox where the ice capsule had sat for 3 days, waiting for Conrad to light his evening fire. She knew the room better than Patrick Rowan had known it. Probably. He had been in it twice, and briefly both times. She had been in it with her full attention, looking at everything, understanding gradually what she was looking at. That had to count for something. The Portland field office was a low building off the interstate, the parking lot salted against the overnight freeze. The American flag out front moving in the same coastal wind that moved everything in Maine in February. Cole parked and they went inside and were met by the Augusta liaison, a tall woman named Reyes, who had the case file memorized and shook hands with the economy of someone who had a great deal to do today and intended to do it efficiently. Patrick Rowan was already in the interview room. She saw him through the observation window before they went in, sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him, his attorney beside him, both of them still and composed in the particular way of people who had agreed in advance on exactly how still and composed they were going to be. Patrick was in a dark jacket, his hair neat, his face carrying the same professional calm she had heard on the phone 3 weeks ago. He looked like a man waiting for a meeting to begin. He looked like a man who had spent considerable time deciding what a man with nothing to hide would look like, and had dressed accordingly. She looked at his hands. They were folded on the table with a stillness that was not quite natural, the stillness of a person maintaining a position rather than resting in one, the slight deliberateness of it visible if you were looking for it, which she was. Cole went in first. Reyes followed. Nora came last and sat at the end of the table where she could see Patrick's face without being directly in his line of sight, the documentation roll giving her the best seat in the room for the thing she was actually there to do. Cole handled the opening. He was good at openings, procedural, unhurried, establishing the formal record without making it feel like an ambush. He introduced everyone. He noted the date and time. He explained that this was a voluntary interview at this stage, that Patrick had the right to terminate at any point, that his attorney was present and would be heard, all of it delivered in the even, factual tone of a man who had done this 300 times and found the ritual useful precisely because it was a ritual. Patrick said he understood. His voice was the same as it had been on the phone, even professional, slightly careful. Cole opened the financial records. He did not lead with the cyanide. He did not lead with the latch or the ice or the firebox. He led with the money. Because the money was the foundation of everything, and because a man who had been stealing $90,000 over 7 years had been lying for 7 years. and a man who had been lying for 7 years had practiced the posture of honesty until it was nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. And the way to find the seam was to start where the lying had started. The compliance reports, the development client, the fraudulent assessment language repeated verbatim across 7 years of supposedly independent fieldwork. The fees, the transfers, each item laid out in order. Cole's voice steady and unhurried, giving Patrick time to hear each piece and understand what it meant before the next one arrived. Patrick's attorney objected twice. Both times, Cole acknowledged the objection and continued. Patrick answered the questions about the reports carefully. He had explanations. The language consistency was standard template use. The fee structure was within normal range for the scope of work. The assessments reflected genuine field conditions that had remained stable over the period in question. The explanations were practiced. She could hear the practice in them, the way a prepared answer had a slightly different texture from a spontaneous one, smoother, more complete. The rough edges filed away in the days between the warrant execution and this morning. She wrote it all down. Then Cole set the compliance reports aside and opened the second folder. The visitor log, the 2 visits, the spark arrestor, the grate residue, the distilled water. He laid each item on the table as he described it, not quickly, not with any drama, just placing each thing in its position, the way you placed pieces in an arrangement that needed to be seen whole before it meant what it meant. Patrick's hands moved for the first time. Not much, a slight shift. The fingers separating briefly before he brought them back together. His attorney leaned toward him, and he leaned back almost imperceptibly, the micro movement of a man reminding himself of a decision he had already made. Cole described the ice capsule, the ice wedge, the professional expertise required to design both the specific knowledge of water behavior in cold conditions, the precise understanding of temperature differentials and refreeze mechanics, the kind of knowledge that an environmental engineer accumulated over years of fieldwork and regulatory work, and that a property attorney or a retired shipyard foreman did not have. The distilled water, Cole said. No mineral content, no organic content. The specific absence of what natural condensation would have deposited in a stone cottage on the Maine coast in February. Patrick was very still. His attorney said his client had no comment on the physical evidence at this time. Cole nodded. He looked at Patrick. He did not say anything for a moment, which was a choice the particular use of silence that Cole made in interview rooms. The space opened deliberately for whatever the other person decided to put into it. Patrick looked at the table. Then he looked up. He looked at Cole first, then at Reyes, then, briefly, at Nora at the end of the table. His gaze moved across her without stopping, which was what she had expected. She was documentation support, the person with the clipboard, the one who was not going to ask him anything or press him on anything, the one who had been looking at him steadily for 40 minutes while everyone else's attention moved around the room. His eyes were the same as his voice, controlled, careful, and underneath the control, in the specific way that things showed themselves underneath control when the control had been maintained for a very long time. Something that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them. The expression of a man who had built something precise and patient and cold, and was now sitting in a room watching it be taken apart, piece by piece, by people who had had 2 weeks and a county lab and an Augusta environmental attorney and an old man's estate inventory and a supplementary swab note that said localized liquid accumulation prior to freezing. He had built it out of water and cold air and the reliable February deep freeze of the Maine coast. He had not anticipated the distilled water. Cole asked him about the first visit, the spark arrestor, the safety concern he had raised with Conrad, the offer to replace the old grate, the 12 minutes of unobserved access to the firebox. Patrick's attorney said his client had no comment. Cole asked him about the second visit, the 12 minutes in the study while Conrad took his call downstairs. No comment. Cole asked him about the drive north on that morning, what he had brought with him, what he had known when he turned off the main road onto the gravel spur and saw the cottage appear between the pines. The attorney said no comment and placed his hand briefly on Patrick's forearm, which was the gesture of a man reminding his client of an agreement. Patrick looked at the table. He did not say no comment himself. He left it to his attorney, which was legally correct and strategically sound, and also the behavior of a man who did not trust his own voice to stay, even through the specific questions that had just been asked, which was the most useful thing Nora had seen in the room all morning. She wrote it down. Cole closed the folder. He thanked Patrick for his time. He told him the investigation was ongoing and that the State Environmental Board inquiry was proceeding in parallel and that he should make himself available for further interview. He said all of this in the same even, procedural tone he had used throughout, giving nothing away, taking the room back to the register it had started in. They were outside in the parking lot 20 minutes later, the coastal wind finding them immediately, the salted asphalt gray and gritty underfoot. Reyes pulled her coat closed. He didn't break. No, Cole said. The financial records will. The Augusta inquiry will. She looked at the building. The distilled water is the piece that matters in court. No defense explanation for distilled water in a latch housing on the Maine coast in February that doesn't require a jury to believe in an extraordinary coincidence. Cole nodded. He looked at Nora. You have everything. Everything. They drove back to Harrow Cove in the same silence they had driven down in. The inland route north, the pine forest and the flat sky, and the occasional town appearing and receding. The heater ran. Cole finished his coffee. Nora watched the landscape and thought about the room. She thought about Conrad in the armchair, with the winter sea on 3 sides and the fire he had lit himself warming the space around him, and the bourbon in the glass he had not touched yet, and the warmth that was building in the room from the hearth and from the gas that was already present in the air. The warmth that was going to stay until it didn't, until the fire burned down and the gas went up the flue and the cold came back into the stone room, and the ice in the latch housing finished its work, and the north window locked itself against the February night. She thought about the ritual of it, the same fire every evening in the same hearth, the same chair, the same glass. The shape of a life repeated until it became the most reliable thing about it. She thought about Patrick knowing that shape, using it, driving 2 hours north on a February morning with the capsule prepared, knowing that Conrad would do what Conrad always did, that the evening would unfold the way it always unfolded, that the only variable was the thing Patrick had placed behind the grate 3 days before. The road curved north, and the coast appeared briefly between the trees, the Atlantic gray and flat and continuous, doing what it did in February, which was simply continue, without any interest in the particular dramas of the shore. She looked at it for the moment it was visible. Then the trees closed back over the road, and the coast was gone, and they drove north through the pine forest with the heater running, and Harrow Cove somewhere ahead of them through the flat February light. The small coastal town going about its ordinary business, the harbor and the boats and the dock and the gulls, and Ed's kitchen with the kettle on, and Biscuit at the base of the oven door, and the particular warmth of a place that continued to be itself, regardless of what had happened on the bluff road to the northeast. She would stop there on the way home. She would hang her coat on the hook and sit at the table, and Ed would put something on the stove without asking, and Biscuit would open one eye and close it again, and the kitchen would be warm in the way it was always warm, built against something specific, maintained against the cold, the kind of warmth that stayed. Cole took the harbor exit off the main road. The station appeared on the hill above the water. He pulled into the lot and cut the engine, and they sat for a moment in the sudden quiet of a car that had stopped moving. "Good work," Cole said. He said it the same way he had said it on Saturday, directly, without elaboration, the whole of what he meant contained in the two words. Then he got out of the car and went inside. Nora sat for a moment longer. The harbor was below her, the water dark and still, the boats at their moorings, the dock lights off in the midday gray. The same harbor it had been for 2 weeks, the same water, the same flat February light doing its usual nothing for warmth. She thought about the spark arrestor, clean steel in an old stone hearth, inconsistent with everything around it, noticed on the first walk-through, before anyone knew there was anything to notice, filed away, returned to. The thing that had been strange from the beginning and had turned out to be strange for a reason. She thought about looking at a room the way the room needed to be looked at. She got out of the car and went inside.